My son didn't send me a wedding invitation. He sent me a bill. $100,000, itemized down to the last glass of champagne and a Paris honeymoon suite overlooking the Seine. Then he called. "Don't come to my wedding, Dad. It'll just make things awkward. But you can cover the $100,000. Be grateful I'm letting you contribute." He even laughed. A soft, practiced laugh. The kind you use when you already think you've won. I stood in my garage in Tacoma, grease still on my hands from a 40-year career in heavy machinery, staring at the phone like it belonged to a stranger. "Security would remove me if I showed up," he added. That was the part that hurt. Not the money. Not even the insult. Being erased. If you're listening tonight, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And please, take care of your health. We men learn too late that stress costs more than $100,000. I didn't argue with my son. I just smiled and reached for something he had completely forgotten about. I'm Victor Langley, 70 years old, American by choice, Canadian by birth. I crossed the border with a single suitcase in 1976 and never looked back. Back then, Tacoma smelled of salt and steel, and opportunity felt as cold and clean as the Pacific wind. I built my life in heavy industry, 40 years repairing cranes, engines, and machines no one else wanted to touch. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. And honest work raised my son. His name is Lucas. When he was 5, he used to sit on a wooden crate in my workshop, swinging his legs while I welded late into the night. "Dad," he once asked, eyes wide behind oversized safety goggles, "do machines get tired?" I smiled and wiped the grease from his cheek. Only when the men who build them forget why they started. Lucas grew into a brilliant young man, sharp, ambitious, and determined to build a life far beyond the noise of steel and diesel. I paid his tuition at the University of Washington. I worked overtime, skipped vacations, and sold my first truck to cover his final semester. Every sacrifice felt like an investment in his future. After his mother passed, it was just the two of us. Quiet dinners, baseball on Sundays. The kind of silence that only fathers and sons understand. For years, I believed nothing could break that bond. Then Sophie entered his life. She was elegant, poised, and always perfectly composed. The first time we met, she shook my hand with a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Langley," she said, her voice smooth as glass. I nodded. "Victor is fine." Lucas adored her. I tried to do the same. But there was something rehearsed about the way she spoke, the way she watched people, as if every room were a stage and every conversation a performance. Still, I stayed silent. Fathers learn to step back when their sons choose their own paths. Years passed. Lucas rose quickly in his career. Sophie's world of galas, investors, and luxury venues replaced the smell of motor oil and sawdust. I didn't belong in that world, but I never expected to be erased from it. The night he called, I was alone in my garage, restoring my old 1968 Ford F-100. The rain tapped gently against the roof, and the air carried the familiar scent of steel and memory. My pocket watch rested beside me on the workbench, its brass surface worn smooth by decades of use, a gift from my father when I left Canada. The phone rang. "Dad," Lucas said, his tone distant, almost rehearsed. "Don't come to the wedding. It'll just make things uncomfortable." I closed my eyes and listened to the rain. He continued, casually, as if discussing the weather. "But I'll need you to cover the $100,000. Consider it your contribution." Silence stretched between us like a fracture. "Lucas," I said quietly, "is that what you truly want?" There was a pause. Then Sophie's voice drifted faintly in the background, sharp and controlled. "He needs to understand his place." Lucas exhaled. "Please don't make this harder than it has to be." The line went dead. I stared at my reflection in the dark window, an old man with grease-stained hands and a lifetime of sacrifices behind him. The pocket watch ticked softly beside me, steady and unyielding, as if reminding me that time never forgets what men try to erase. I picked it up, turning the worn brass case in my palm. My father's engraving caught the dim light. "Legacy is not given, it is earned." And in that quiet garage, I realized something my son had forgotten, and Sophie had never known. The morning after Lucas's call, the rain had stopped, leaving Tacoma wrapped in a pale gray silence. I opened the garage door and let the cold air drift in. The scent of steel, oil, and damp wood lingered like an old memory. My 1968 Ford F-100 sat beneath the hanging light, its chrome reflecting the quiet dignity of a life built slowly, one sacrifice at a time. I turned the pocket watch in my hand. The steady ticking calmed me. Time had always been honest, even when people were not. Lucas used to love this place. As a boy, he would sit on the workbench and watch me rebuild engines. "Dad," he once whispered, tracing the grooves of a wrench, "when I grow up, I'm going to make you proud." "You already do," I told him, smiling through a film of grease and exhaustion. But pride changes shape with time, and so do people. 3 days after his call, an envelope arrived at my door. Cream-colored, embossed, elegant. It bore Lucas's name in silver lettering. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it was an invitation, a quiet apology, perhaps. Instead, inside was an itemized invoice, $42,000 for the reception venue overlooking Puget Sound, $18,500 for catering and imported champagne, $22,300 for a Paris honeymoon suite, and at the bottom, in meticulous script, total due, $100,284. There was no note, no explanation, just the expectation of obedience. I folded the invoice slowly and set it beside the pocket watch. The contrast was almost poetic. One symbolized legacy, the other entitlement. Later that afternoon, Lucas called again. "Did you receive the invoice, Dad?" His voice was polite, rehearsed, as if he were speaking to a client rather than his father. "Yes," I replied calmly. "I received it." A pause followed, heavy with unspoken tension. "Good," he said. "The vendors need confirmation soon." "And the invitation?" I asked quietly. Another silence. Then Sophie's voice echoed faintly in the background, sharp, controlled, unmistakable. "We agreed this was best for everyone." Lucas cleared his throat. "Dad, please don't complicate things. This wedding is important to us." I closed my eyes and listened to the ticking of the watch. "I understand," I said at last. But understanding does not always mean acceptance. That evening, I drove along the waterfront, watching the ferries glide across the darkening water. Tacoma's lights shimmered like distant memories. I thought of the years I had spent building a future for my son. Every late shift, every sacrifice, every quiet prayer whispered over cold dinners and unpaid dreams. I had never asked for gratitude, only respect. The next day, I stopped by an old machine shop near the port, a place I had helped keep alive decades ago. The owner, a retired foreman named Arthur Bennett, greeted me with a firm handshake and a knowing smile. "Victor Langley," he said warmly. "Still keeping time, I see." I held up the pocket watch. "Some things are worth preserving." Arthur studied me for a moment. "You look like a man carrying more than memories." "I am," I admitted, "but it's nothing I can't handle." As we spoke, a framed photograph caught my eye, a group of young apprentices standing proudly beside a newly built crane. Beneath it hung a plaque honoring donors to the Langley Infrastructure Scholarship Fund. Arthur followed my gaze. "Those kids wouldn't be here without you," he said quietly. 12 new engineers this year alone." I nodded, saying nothing. Not even Lucas knew the full extent of what I had set in motion. Not Sophie, not anyone. Legacy was never meant to be announced, only revealed. That night, I returned home and placed the invoice and pocket watch side by side on my desk. The ticking grew louder in the stillness, echoing like a reminder from the past. I reached for my phone, opened a secure folder, and stared at the document resting inside. One Lucas had never seen, and Sophie had never imagined existed. Then I smiled softly and whispered to the empty room, "It's time." And somewhere across the city, preparations for a perfect wedding continued, unaware that everything was about to change. The following week, Tacoma settled into one of those quiet, gray mornings where the sky felt low enough to touch. I drove downtown slowly, the steady ticking of my pocket watch echoing in the silence beside me. Time had always been my companion, patient, faithful, and unforgiving. My destination was a modest brick building near the waterfront, the Langley Trust Office. Few people knew it existed. Fewer still knew why. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. Margaret Doyle, my attorney of nearly 30 years, looked up from her desk as I entered. Her silver hair was pinned neatly in place, her eyes sharp with recognition. "Victor," she said warmly, rising to greet me, "it's been too long." "Not long enough," I replied, with a faint smile. "I wish the circumstances were kinder." She studied my expression, then gestured toward the chair across from her. "Tell me what's happened." I placed the cream-colored invoice on her desk. The numbers caught the morning light. $100,284.75. Cold and precise. Margaret adjusted her glasses and read silently. When she finished, she exhaled slowly. "He expects you to pay this?" "Yes," I said calmly, "and he expects me not to attend his wedding." A quiet pause settled between us. "And Sophie?" she asked gently. I met her gaze. "She believes I have no place in their future." Margaret's expression hardened, not with anger, but with resolve. "They've underestimated you, Victor." I removed my pocket watch and set it beside the invoice. Its steady ticking filled the room. "I didn't come here for revenge," I said softly. "Only for clarity." She nodded, understanding more than I needed to explain. Turning to her computer, she accessed a secure file. Within moments, a document appeared on the screen, one Lucas had never seen. The Langley Family Trust. Margaret folded her hands. "Your son received an educational and business advancement clause years ago. He signed it himself. Any future inheritance may be adjusted accordingly." "In other words," I said quietly, "he has already taken his share." She inclined her head. "Yes, and should you choose to redirect the remaining assets, it would be entirely lawful." The words settled heavily in the room, like dust in a beam of sunlight. I felt no triumph, only a calm, steady certainty. Legacy was not punishment, it was purpose. Where would you redirect it? Margaret asked. I thought of the machine shop near the port, of the young apprentices standing beside steel giants they had built with their own hands, of futures shaped not by entitlement, but by effort. To the Langley Infrastructure Scholarship Fund, I said. Margaret's lips curved into a quiet smile. 12 new engineers every year, she said. Your son never knew, did he? No, I replied, and neither did Sophie. She printed the necessary documents and placed them before me. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted not by ink, but by years of sacrifice and memory. I signed slowly, the pen gliding across the page with deliberate finality. The ticking of the pocket watch grew louder in the stillness. Margaret closed the folder. When will you tell him? I stood, slipping the watch back into my vest. I won't, I said quietly. Not yet. Outside, the afternoon light shimmered across Puget Sound. Ferries moved like silent ghosts across the water, carrying strangers toward futures they could not yet see. I paused on the steps, breathing in the salt air, and felt a calm I had not known in years. For the first time, I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. As I reached my car, my phone vibrated. Lucas's name appeared on the screen. I answered. Dad, he said, his voice tight with urgency. The vendors need confirmation today. Have you arranged the payment? I glanced at the signed documents resting on the passenger seat and allowed myself a measured smile. Yes, Lucas, I said evenly. Everything is proceeding exactly as planned. There was a pause, brief, uncertain. Then Sophie's voice drifted faintly through the line, sharp and controlled. Make sure he understands his role. The call ended. I looked out over the water, the steady rhythm of the watch echoing against my chest, and knew that, very soon, they would. 3 days later, the rain returned to Tacoma, tapping softly against the windows of my study like a patient reminder. I sat at my desk, the cream-colored invoice lying beside my pocket watch, its steady ticking filling the quiet room. The number at the bottom, $100,284.75, no longer angered me. It clarified everything. That morning, I received a call from Margaret Doyle. Victor, she said, her voice measured. There's something you should know. Lucas applied for a line of credit last month. He listed a projected inheritance from the Langley Trust as collateral. I closed my eyes, letting her words settle like dust in sunlight. He never mentioned it, I replied calmly. I suspected as much, she continued. The bank is relying on assumptions that may no longer hold. A faint smile touched my lips, not of triumph, but of understanding. Thank you, Margaret. Please keep me informed. When the call ended, I sat in silence, listening to the ticking of the watch. Time, I had learned, reveals truth with patience no man can outrun. That afternoon, Lucas called again. Dad, he said, his tone tight with urgency. The venue needs confirmation today. They won't hold the date without a deposit. I see, I replied evenly. We're talking about the Grand Pavilion overlooking Puget Sound, he continued, his voice edged with pride. Sophie has worked tirelessly to make this perfect. In the background, I heard her voice, soft, controlled, and unmistakably confident. He just needs to finalize the transfer, she murmured. Lucas cleared his throat. It's only fair, Dad. After everything you've done for me, this is your chance to contribute to something meaningful. Meaningful? I glanced at the invoice resting on my desk. Of course, I said quietly. I wouldn't want to disappoint you. Relief softened his tone. I knew you'd understand. After the call ended, I placed the phone beside the pocket watch and watched the second hand glide forward with quiet certainty. They believed the matter settled. They believed time was on their side. But time had always belonged to those who understood it. That evening, I drove to the Grand Pavilion. The glass-walled venue stood elegantly above the water, its reflection shimmering in the fading light. Inside, workers prepared floral arrangements while chandeliers glowed like suspended stars. Sophie stood near the windows, speaking with a wedding coordinator, her posture flawless, her smile immaculate. When she noticed me, her expression flickered with surprise, quickly replaced by composure. "Mr. Langley," she said, her voice polished, "I wasn't expecting you." "I was in the area," I replied calmly. "I wanted to see where Lucas plans to begin his future." Her eyes studied me, searching for something she could measure and dismiss. "It will be unforgettable," she said, gesturing toward the water. "Everything has been carefully arranged." "I'm sure it has," I said, my tone steady. Lucas approached moments later, his expression tight with uncertainty. "Dad, you didn't have to come." "I know," I answered quietly, "but I wanted to see it for myself." He hesitated, then nodded. "Well, as long as everything is settled." Sophie's smile returned, precise and confident. "The vendors simply need confirmation," she said. "Once the payment clears, we can finalize the Paris arrangements." I met her gaze without flinching. "Everything is proceeding exactly as planned." For a moment, silence settled between us. The distant hum of the water and the soft clink of glassware filled the air. Sophie's eyes lingered on me, searching for reassurance, or perhaps control. She found neither. As I turned to leave, Lucas followed me outside. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice uncertain. "You're not upset, are you?" I looked at him, the boy who once sat on a wooden crate in my workshop, dreaming of the future. "No, Lucas," I said gently. "I'm not upset." He exhaled, relieved. "I knew you'd understand." I smiled faintly and placed my hand on his shoulder. "Understanding," I said softly, "comes with time." The wind carried the scent of salt across the water as I walked back to my car. The pocket watch ticked steadily against my chest, each second marking a truth neither Lucas nor Sophie had yet discovered. The next morning, Margaret Doyle called again. "Victor," she said, her tone calm but deliberate. "The bank has requested verification of the Langley Trust. They're preparing to finalize Lucas's loan." I stared at the horizon beyond my window, the gray sky stretching endlessly over Puget Sound. "Very well," I replied. "Provide them with the documentation they've requested." There was a brief pause. "And the adjustments?" she asked quietly. I allowed myself a measured breath. "Proceed as scheduled." After the call ended, I opened my desk drawer and retrieved the signed documents. The ink had long since dried, but their meaning remained sharp and irrevocable. I placed them beside the invoice and watched the pocket watch tick between them, past and future, separated by a single moment of truth. Somewhere across the city, Lucas and Sophie continued planning their perfect wedding, unaware that the foundation beneath it had already begun to shift. The rehearsal dinner invitation arrived on a quiet Thursday morning, sealed in silver and embossed with elegant lettering. I turned it slowly in my hands, studying the delicate script as the steady ticking of my pocket watch echoed through the room. Time had a peculiar way of revealing intentions long before words ever could. Lucas's name appeared first. Sophie's followed in graceful calligraphy. Mine was absent. Yet inside the envelope, tucked behind the formal invitation, was a smaller card, thin, discreet, and deliberate contribution. Confirmation required. Prior to event, I exhaled softly. So this was not an invitation. It was a reminder. I placed the card beside the invoice and listened to the quiet rhythm of the watch. Its ticking filled the silence like a heartbeat, steady, patient, inevitable. That afternoon, Lucas called. "Dad," he said, his voice measured but strained. "You received the rehearsal dinner details, didn't you?" "Yes," I replied calmly. "I received them." There was a brief pause, as if he were searching for the right words. "We're finalizing everything," he continued. "The vendors need assurance. Sophie has worked very hard on this." In the background, I heard her voice, soft, precise, and unmistakably controlled. "He just needs to confirm the transfer," she murmured. I leaned back in my chair, watching the gray sky drift beyond the window. "Lucas," I said gently, "are you happy?" The question caught him off guard. "Yes, of course I am," he answered, though his certainty sounded rehearsed. "This is the future we've planned." I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering the boy who once asked if machines could grow tired. "Then that is all that matters," I said quietly. Relief softened his tone. "I knew you'd understand." After the call ended, I drove to the waterfront. The ferries moved across Puget Sound like silent witnesses, their white silhouettes fading into the mist. Tacoma's skyline shimmered beneath the overcast sky, a quiet reminder of the years I had spent building a life that would outlast me. At the Langley Trust office, Margaret Doyle was waiting. "Victor," she greeted me, her voice calm yet purposeful. "The bank has requested final verification of Lucas's projected inheritance. They're preparing to secure his line of credit." I nodded, placing the pocket watch on her desk. "Has the adjustment been recorded?" "Yes," she replied, sliding a document toward me. "The advancement clause has been confirmed. The remaining estate has been reassigned to the Langley Infrastructure Scholarship Fund. Legally, everything is in order." I studied the document, the ink dark and final. "And Lucas?" "He has no knowledge of the change," Margaret said quietly. "Nor does Sophie." I allowed myself a measured breath, not satisfaction, only clarity. "Good," I said softly. "Let events proceed as planned." Margaret hesitated before speaking again. "Victor, are you certain this is what you want?" "Once the verification reaches the bank, the consequences will be immediate." I closed the watch and slipped it into my vest. "Consequences," I replied, "are merely the truth arriving on time." Outside, the wind carried the scent of salt and rain across the water. I stood for a moment, watching the ferries glide across Puget Sound, their paths steady and unhurried. Time moved forward, indifferent to expectation. That evening, Lucas called once more. "Dad," he said, his voice tight with urgency, "the bank needs confirmation tomorrow. They won't finalize the arrangements without it." "I understand," I replied, evenly. Sophie's voice drifted through the line, clear and composed. "This wedding must be perfect, Lucas. Everything depends on it." I could almost see her, standing beside him, poised, unconfident, certain of the future she had constructed. "I will handle it," I said calmly. There was a pause. "Thank you, Dad," Lucas whispered, relief softening his voice. "I knew I could count on you." The call ended. I placed the phone beside the invoice and watched the second hand of my pocket watch glide forward. Each tick carried the quiet weight of truth, drawing closer to a moment neither Lucas nor Sophie could yet imagine. The following morning, Margaret Doyle's name appeared on my phone. "Victor," she said, her voice steady but deliberate, "the bank has officially requested verification. Once I respond, Lucas's loan will be reevaluated. I looked out across the gray horizon, where the water met the sky in a seamless line of steel and mist. Proceed, I said quietly. There was a pause. Brief, inevitable. And the trust documents? She asked. I allowed myself a faint, measured smile. Release them when requested, I replied. It's time Lucas understands what he has already received and what he no longer has. Silence settled on the line. Then Margaret spoke softly, almost reverently. Very well, Victor. I'll begin the process. As I ended the call, the pocket watch ticked steadily against my chest, its rhythm echoing like a promise fulfilled. Somewhere across Tacoma, Lucas and Sophie were preparing for their perfect wedding, unaware that the future they depended on had already begun to change. And tomorrow, the bank would be the first to discover the truth. The call from Margaret Doyle came just after dawn. Tacoma was still wrapped in a pale gray hush, the sky hovering low over Puget Sound like a breath held too long. I stood by the window with a cup of black coffee warming my hands, listening to the quiet ticking of my pocket watch. Time moved forward with its usual indifference, but this morning it felt heavier. Victor, Margaret said, her voice steady. The bank has completed its verification. Lucas's line of credit has been flagged for review. I closed my eyes for a moment. And the reason? They discovered the advancement clause, she replied. The $100,284.75 you provided for his education and business support was recorded as an inheritance advance. Legally, it has already been deducted from the Langley Family Trust. The words settled gently, without triumph, only truth. And Lucas? I asked quietly. He has not been informed yet, Margaret said. But the bank will contact him today. I thanked her and ended the call. The ticking of the watch seemed louder now, steady, patient, inevitable. I slipped it into my vest and watched the ferries glide across the Sound, their white silhouettes dissolving into the mist. Somewhere across the city, Lucas and Sophie were preparing for their perfect future, unaware that the foundation beneath it had already shifted. The call came an hour later. Dad? Lucas's voice trembled, the confidence stripped away. I just spoke with the bank. They said my inheritance. It's already been allocated. There must be a mistake. I leaned against the window, gazing out at the steel-gray horizon. There is no mistake, Lucas. Silence followed, long and fragile. What do you mean? He whispered. The funds you received for your education and your first business were recorded as an advance from the Langley Trust, I said calmly. You signed the agreement yourself. I heard him exhale sharply, disbelief flooding his voice. But that was years ago. I didn't realize. Sophie's voice cut through the line, sharp and controlled. Lucas, ask him what he's done. He hesitated. Dad, what did you do? I spoke gently, without anger. I honored my obligations, and I redirected the remaining assets to the Langley Infrastructure Scholarship Fund. There was a long pause. I could almost feel the weight of the truth settling around them. You gave it away? Sophie demanded, her voice rising despite her effort to remain composed. That money was meant for Lucas, for our future. It was meant to build a legacy, I replied quietly, and it still will. Lucas's breathing grew uneven. Why didn't you tell me? I closed my eyes, remembering the boy who once sat beside me in the workshop. Because legacy is not something we inherit, Lucas, I said softly. It's something we earn. Silence swallowed the line. Then Sophie spoke again, her voice colder now. "You've humiliated us. Do you realize what this means for the wedding? The bank is reconsidering our loan." I allowed myself a measured breath. Consequences arrive when truth is overdue. Lucas's voice returned, fragile and uncertain. "Dad, are you saying you won't help us?" "I am saying," I answered gently, "that you are capable of standing on your own." The call ended without goodbye. For a long moment, I remained by the window, listening to the steady rhythm of the watch against my chest. I felt no anger, no triumph, only a quiet clarity that comes when time finally reveals what men try to ignore. That afternoon, I visited the old machine shop near the port. Arthur Bennett greeted me with a firm handshake, his weathered face creasing into a knowing smile. "Victor," he said warmly, "I heard the scholarship fund received another donation." 12 students this year," I replied, "and many more to come." Arthur nodded, pride shining in his eyes. "You've built something that will outlast all of us." I glanced at the young apprentices working beside the cranes, their laughter echoing through the steel beams. "That was always the intention," I said quietly. As I prepared to leave, my phone vibrated once more. Lucas's name appeared on the screen, followed by a message. "We need to talk. Sophie says this changes everything." I read the words slowly, then slipped the phone back into my pocket. The pocket watch ticked steadily, marking each passing second with unwavering certainty. Across Tacoma, preparations for the rehearsal dinner continued. Chandeliers polished, champagne chilled, vows rehearsed beneath the soft glow of expectation. But for the first time, Lucas and Sophie understood that the future they had counted on no longer belonged to them. And tomorrow night, at the rehearsal dinner overlooking Puget Sound, the truth would be revealed to everyone. The rehearsal dinner was held on a clear autumn evening overlooking Puget Sound. The sky glowed with soft shades of amber and blue, and the glass walls of the grand pavilion reflected the fading light like a polished mirror. Inside, chandeliers shimmered above white linen tables, and the gentle hum of conversation drifted through the room like distant music. I arrived alone. My gray suit was modest, pressed with care, and my pocket watch rested in my vest, ticking steadily against my heart. No one announced my presence, yet a subtle hush followed as I stepped inside. Some guests recognized me, the quiet father who had built a life of steel and sacrifice. Others simply noticed the stillness I carried with me. Lucas stood near the center of the room, speaking with a group of investors. When he saw me, his expression flickered with surprise, then uncertainty. Sophie stood beside him, radiant and composed, in a pale silk gown, her smile flawless as ever. "Dad?" Lucas whispered, stepping forward. "You came." "I was not invited," I replied calmly, "but I was expected." His gaze fell briefly, the truth settling between us like dust in sunlight. Sophie approached with measured grace. "Mr. Langley," she said smoothly, her voice warm yet guarded. "We're glad you could join us this evening." Her eyes studied me carefully, searching for hesitation or weakness. She found neither. "This is a beautiful venue," I said, glancing toward the glass walls overlooking the water. "You've planned it well." "Perfection requires discipline," she replied, her smile precise. "Lucas and I have worked very hard to create something unforgettable." "I'm sure you have," I said, quietly. The evening unfolded with effortless elegance. Crystal glasses chimed softly, and laughter floated through the hall as servers moved silently between the tables. I listened more than I spoke, observing the world my son had chosen, a world of polished smiles and measured ambition. As the dinner progressed, the master of ceremonies tapped his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced warmly, "it is our honor to invite the father of the groom to share a few words." A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. Lucas turned to me, his eyes uncertain. Sophie's posture remained flawless, though her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I rose slowly. The pocket watch ticked against my chest as I stepped forward, each second echoing in the silence. When I reached the podium, I looked out over the room, at Lucas, at Sophie, at the guests gathered beneath the glow of chandeliers and expectation. "For most of my life," I began softly, "I worked with machines, steel, engines, and cranes. They taught me something simple. Strength is built quietly, one bolt at a time." The room fell still. When Lucas was a boy, he sat beside me in my workshop and asked if machines ever grew tired. I told him they only did when the men who built them forgot why they began. A faint smile touched my lips. Tonight, I see a man who has built something extraordinary, a future filled with promise and ambition. And as his father, I am proud of him, Lucas lowered his gaze, emotion flickering across his face. I reached into my pocket and placed the worn brass watch on the podium. Its steady ticking carried through the silence. "My father gave me this watch when I left Canada," I continued. "He told me that legacy is not given. It is earned." I paused, allowing the words to settle gently in the room. "Before I offer my blessing, I believe in transparency. Years ago, Lucas received an inheritance advancement to support his education and his first business. It was an investment in his future, one he has already earned." A murmur spread through the guests. Sophie's smile remained fixed, though her eyes sharpened with sudden awareness. "As a result," I said calmly, "the remaining assets of the Langley Family Trust have been redirected to the Langley Infrastructure Scholarship Fund, supporting young engineers who will build the bridges and machines of tomorrow." Silence fell like snowfall. Lucas stood motionless, his face pale with realization. Sophie's composure wavered for the first time, a flicker of disbelief crossing her eyes. I met Lucas's gaze gently. "A man can build a wedding in a day," I said softly, "but a legacy takes a lifetime." No accusation, no anger, only truth. I lifted the watch, slipped it back into my vest, and stepped away from the podium. Applause followed, polite at first, then steady, carried by respect rather than spectacle. Lucas approached me, his voice barely audible. "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were meant to stand on your own," I replied quietly. Behind him, Sophie stood motionless, her perfect smile fading beneath the weight of revelation. She leaned toward Lucas and whispered sharply, "If you let him do this, everything we planned is over." Lucas's expression tightened, torn between pride and doubt. Outside, the lights of Puget Sound shimmered against the darkening water, and the steady ticking of the watch echoed softly against my chest. The evening continued, but something fundamental had shifted. And as Lucas turned back toward Sophie, uncertainty clouding his eyes, I knew the decision he made next would change everything. The applause faded slowly, like the tide retreating from the shore. Conversations resumed, but the air inside the grand pavilion had changed. Beneath the glow of chandeliers and the soft clink of crystal, a quiet tension lingered, unspoken, undeniable. I stepped away from the podium and returned to my seat near the window. Puget Sound stretched into the night, its dark surface broken by the steady movement of ferries drifting through the mist. The pocket watch rested against my chest, ticking calmly, as though time itself remained indifferent to the turmoil it had just unveiled. Lucas approached me moments later. "Dad!" His voice trembled, stripped of its former certainty. "Why didn't you tell me about the trust?" I looked at him, seeing not the confident man in a tailored suit, but the boy who once sat beside me in a quiet workshop. "Because legacy isn't something we inherit blindly," I said gently. "It's something we earn with our own hands." He swallowed hard, his gaze searching mine. "But the bank, they've already contacted me. They're reconsidering the loan." "I expected they would," I replied calmly. Behind him, Sophie stood near the bar, her posture flawless, though the faint tightening of her jaw betrayed her composure. She approached slowly, her expression polished but brittle beneath the surface. "Mr. Langley," she said, her voice smooth yet edged with restraint. "Your announcement was unexpected." "Truth often is," I answered quietly. Her smile faltered for an instant. "You've placed Lucas in a very difficult position. The wedding arrangements depend on the financing we secured." Lucas exhaled sharply. "Sophie, please." "No," she interrupted softly, though the steel in her voice was unmistakable. "This concerns our future." I met her gaze without hostility. "Your future should rest on your own foundation, not on assumptions about mine." Silence settled between us, fragile and absolute. Sophie's eyes narrowed, the polished warmth slipping away to reveal something colder beneath. "If you let him do this, Lucas," she whispered, her voice low but urgent, "everything we planned is over." Lucas looked from her to me, uncertainty clouding his expression. "I never wanted things to happen this way," he said quietly. "Nor did I replied. "But every man must choose the life he stands for." The words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Later that evening, the rehearsal dinner continued with forced elegance. Laughter returned in measured bursts, and the musicians resumed their gentle melodies. Yet beneath the surface, the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Guests whispered behind crystal glasses, and subtle glances followed Lucas and Sophie as they moved through the room. As I prepared to leave, Arthur Bennett approached me with a warm smile. "Victor," he said quietly, "that was a fine speech. Those students you're helping, 12 this year, wasn't it?" "12, I confirmed, and more to come." Arthur nodded approvingly. "You've built something that will outlast all of us." I glanced toward Lucas across the room, his shoulders tense beneath the weight of expectation. "That was always the intention," I said softly. Outside, the cool night air carried the scent of salt and autumn leaves. I stepped onto the terrace overlooking Puget Sound, the city lights shimmering across the water like scattered stars. The pocket watch ticked steadily, marking each passing second with quiet certainty. Footsteps approached behind me. "Dad," Lucas said, his voice subdued. I turned to face him. "I didn't know," he admitted, his eyes searching mine. "About the advancement, about the scholarship fund. Sophie says this changes everything." "Does it?" I asked gently. He hesitated, the conflict in his eyes unmistakable. "I don't know anymore." The wind stirred softly between us, carrying the distant sound of waves against the shore. "Lucas," I said quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder, "a man's future is not measured by what he receives, but by what he builds." He lowered his gaze, absorbing the words in silence. Behind him, Sophie appeared at the doorway, her silhouette framed by the warm glow of the pavilion. Her voice cut through the night, calm but resolute. "Lucas, we need to talk. Now." He looked at me once more, uncertainty etched across his face. I'll call you tomorrow, he said softly. I'll be here, I replied. Lucas turned and walked back toward Sophie, their figures disappearing into the light. I remained on the terrace, listening to the steady ticking of the watch, aware that the evening had drawn an invisible line between past and future. The following morning, my phone rang. It was Margaret Doyle. "Victor," she said, her voice composed but deliberate. "The bank has officially revised Lucas's loan terms. Without the trust backing, the vendors are requesting immediate confirmation. Some are already reconsidering their contracts." I gazed out at the gray horizon, the water merging seamlessly with the sky. "Thank you, Margaret," I said quietly. "Let events proceed as they must." There was a brief pause before she spoke again. "Are you certain you wish to attend the wedding?" I allowed myself a faint, measured smile. "Yes," I replied softly. "I wouldn't miss it." Across Tacoma, preparations continued. Flowers arranged, vows rehearsed, champagne chilled beneath the illusion of perfection. Yet beneath the surface, uncertainty had begun to unravel the future Lucas and Sophie believed was secure. And on the morning of the wedding, Lucas would face a choice that would determine not only his future, but the meaning of everything he had ever believed. The morning of the wedding arrived, wrapped in a pale, silver mist. Tacoma stood quiet beneath a sky that seemed to hold its breath, and Puget Sound shimmered faintly beyond the glass walls of the grand pavilion. I adjusted my tie slowly, listening to the steady ticking of my pocket watch, a familiar rhythm that had guided me through decades of triumph and loss. Time, I had learned, reveals truth when men are finally ready to face it. When I arrived at the venue, the air was filled with the soft fragrance of white roses and polished cedar. Guests moved gracefully beneath crystal chandeliers, their voices hushed with anticipation. No one announced my presence, yet subtle glances followed as I stepped inside. The father of the groom, uninvited, yet undeniable. Lucas stood near the altar, his expression composed but distant. The tailored suit, the perfect setting, the carefully orchestrated elegance, everything spoke of ambition fulfilled. Yet when his eyes met mine, something fragile flickered beneath his confidence. "Dad," he said quietly, stepping forward. "You came." "I wouldn't have missed it," I replied gently. He hesitated, then exhaled, as though a weight he had carried for years had suddenly grown heavier. "The bank called again this morning," he admitted. "Without the trust backing, they've revised the loan. Some vendors have withdrawn. Sophie says we can still proceed, but things aren't what we planned." I studied his face, seeing both the boy he once was and the man he struggled to become. "Plans change," I said softly. "Character does not." Before he could respond, Sophie approached, radiant in a gown of ivory silk. Her posture was flawless, her smile luminous, but her eyes betrayed a quiet storm beneath the surface. "Mr. Langley," she said, her voice composed, "I see you decided to attend after all." "This is my son's wedding," I replied calmly. "I have every reason to be here." Her gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. "You've made things more complicated than necessary." "Truth has a way of doing that," I said gently. For a moment, her composure faltered. Then she turned to Lucas, her voice low and urgent. "The ceremony begins in 10 minutes. We need to focus." Lucas nodded, but his eyes lingered on me, uncertain and searching. As the guests took their seats, the soft strains of a string quartet filled the hall. Sunlight filtered through the glass, casting shimmering reflections across the polished floor. I took a seat near the aisle, the ticking of my pocket watch steady against my chest, marking each second with quiet certainty. The ceremony began. Sophie walked down the aisle with measured grace, her expression serene and resolute. Lucas watched her approach, yet his gaze drifted briefly toward me. Toward the past, he could neither deny nor escape. When the officiant asked who supported this union, silence hung in the air for a fleeting moment. I rose slowly. "I do," I said, my voice calm and unwavering. A ripple of murmurs passed through the guests. Lucas's eyes widened, emotion flickering across his face. Sophie's expression remained composed, though the tension in her smile betrayed the effort behind it. The vows were spoken with careful precision, each word echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling like a promise carved in glass. Yet beneath the elegance, uncertainty lingered, a quiet reminder that the foundation beneath them had shifted. When the officiant invited Lucas to speak, he hesitated. He looked at Sophie, then at me. "I once believed success was measured by what a man received," he began, his voice unsteady but sincere. "But today, I understand that it is measured by what he builds, and by the strength to stand on his own." A hush settled over the room. "I will pay for this wedding myself," he continued quietly. "Not because I must, but because I choose to." Sophie's composure faltered for the briefest moment, surprise flashing in her eyes before she masked it with a poised smile. The guests exchanged glances, murmurs rising softly through the hall. I felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of peace. Lucas turned to me, his gaze steady now. "Thank you, Dad," he said softly, "for teaching me what legacy truly means." I inclined my head, the pocket watch ticking gently against my heart. "Every man must discover that for himself," I replied. The ceremony concluded beneath a cascade of applause. Lucas and Sophie were pronounced husband and wife, their future sealed not by inheritance, but by choice. Yet as the guests gathered for the reception, Margaret Doyle approached discreetly, her expression composed but deliberate. "Victor," she said quietly, "the bank has finalized its decision. Without the trust backing, they've reduced Lucas's credit line significantly. Several vendors have withdrawn their contracts. The reception may not proceed as planned." I nodded, unsurprised. Across the hall, Sophie stood beside Lucas, her radiant smile now touched with strain as whispers spread among the guests. She leaned toward him, her voice low but urgent. "This isn't what we agreed on," she said. "Everything is falling apart." Lucas looked at her, then at me, uncertainty flickering once more in his eyes. The pocket watch ticked steadily. Time had spoken. And before the evening ended, Lucas would face one final choice, between the life he had promised and the legacy he had just begun to understand. The reception ended without grandeur. There were no fireworks over Puget Sound, no orchestra swelling beneath chandeliers. Some vendors had withdrawn quietly, their absence leaving empty spaces where extravagance once stood. Yet the evening did not collapse. It simply changed. The celebration continued with modest dignity, sustained not by inheritance, but by choice. I watched from a distance as Lucas greeted the remaining guests, his voice steady, his posture resolute. Sophie stood beside him, radiant as ever, though the flawless certainty she once carried had softened into something quieter and more uncertain. Their smiles were polite, practiced, but no longer invincible. Time, I realized, does not destroy illusions. It reveals what lies beneath them. 6 months passed. Winter settled gently over Tacoma, and the waters of Puget Sound reflected the pale light of early morning. I stood in a lecture hall at the University of Washington, listening as 12 young engineers received their certificates under the Langley Infrastructure Scholarship Fund. Their applause filled the room with a promise stronger than any fortune. Arthur Bennett stood beside me, his weathered face bright with pride. "You did good, Victor," he said softly. "These kids will build things that last." I nodded, watching the students shake hands with quiet determination. "That was always the intention," I replied. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. Lucas. His voice was calmer now, stripped of ambition's sharp edge. "Dad," he said gently, "I wanted to thank you. I paid off the remaining wedding debts myself. It wasn't easy, but I understand now." I smiled faintly, listening to the familiar steadiness in his tone. "I never doubted you would." There was a pause before he spoke again. "Sophie and I are learning to build our future on our own. It's different than we expected." "Sometimes," I said quietly, "different is what makes it real." We spoke a while longer, no accusations, no regret. Only the quiet understanding that comes when truth arrives and remains. When the call ended, I removed my pocket watch and turned it gently in my hand. The engraving caught the winter light. Legacy is not given, it is earned. I thought of my father, of the workshop in Tacoma, of the sacrifices that shaped a lifetime. Respect, I had learned, is not demanded by wealth or secured by inheritance. It is forged through character, patience, and the courage to stand with dignity, even when the world believes you have been forgotten. In the end, no one was ruined, no fortune was destroyed. But everything changed. Lucas became a man who stood on his own. Sophie learned that elegance cannot replace integrity. And I found peace, not in revenge, but in preserving the legacy I was entrusted to protect. If you have listened this far, thank you for sharing this journey with me today. Please let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. I enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And when you reach the end, rate this story from 1 to 10. Your feedback helps me create even stronger and more meaningful stories for you. Please note that this story contains fictional elements woven in for entertainment, education, and reflection. If this story moved you even a little, another one is waiting on your screen. YouTube believes you will enjoy it, so sit back, relax, and continue the journey.